Hey everyone, I'm John, and thanks for joining me here in the Boneyard for another Boneyard Cinema podcast. If you are a regular here on the channel, you will know by now that I am a huge George A Romero fan. In my eyes, he is a true trailblazer, an inspiration to all independent movie creators. This episode, I want to talk about a movie that is a remake of a very important movie in Romero's career. A movie that originally had very little distribution and sank beneath the radar of many horror fans over the years until its rediscovery on home media, and then Romero's resurrection after the 2004 remake of his horror classic, Dawn of the Dead. So please stick to bottled and canned liquids and join me this episode as we take a deep dive into the infected waters of Evans City and take a look at the Crazies 2010.
Would you mind taking a look at Bill?
Sure, what's wrong?
I don't know. He's just not right.
She worries too much. I'm fine.
You got any plans this weekend?
She worries too much. I'm fine.
Military started shooting town folk.
We gotta get out of here, guys!
The 2010 remake of The Crazies, directed by Breck Eisner, is by no means an anomaly. It came at a time when Hollywood was in crisis and was reinterpreting and trying to reinvent its own genre heritage. Originally directed by George A Romero in 1973, the original film is a politically charged, low-budget horror exploring military distrust and social collapse when a biological weapon of warfare is released into the water supply of a small rural town, turning anyone who drinks the water into crazed killers. It is a tale of society turning upon itself. Breck Eisner's remake, released nearly 4 decades later, updates the material for 21st century audiences, but decides to leave the more political aspect of the original about military distrust and uncaring politicians on the sidelines, and instead emphasizes grueling horror action sequences over overt satire. Something I find very interesting about the Crazies remake, and indeed the decade of remakes that came before it, and the other remakes that came after it, is that it reflects broader film industry history and working practices at the studios. Particularly the post-2007 Writers Guild of America strike and the mid-2000s trend of horror remakes that provided studios with safe intellectual property. Let's take a quick listen to the Writers Guild of America strike announcement from November 2nd, 2007 to more fully understand why the strike occurred and, more importantly, how history seems to be repeating itself today.
As many of you know, 3 weeks ago, the members of the Writers Guilds of America voted overwhelmingly to authorize a strike if we could not reach a fair and reasonable deal with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. 20 years ago, these companies forced writers to accept an unfairly low residual for home videos so that the market could grow. And even though those markets did grow to become an extremely profitable revenue stream, the residuals never did. The fact is, there was no need for conflict on these issues. The companies are doing very well in the marketplace. As the chairman of one of the big 6 media conglomerates recently stated, the internet is a source of additional income. Television and film sales to the internet have not to date cannibalized viewers from broadcast and cable. And the economics of digital distribution are even more favorable than the economics of DVDs. Digital has no hard media costs, no boxes, no marginal extra shipping and handling. The only substantial economic issue for internet reuse is the residual payment to directors, actors, and writers. That is why our position is simple and fair. When a writer's work generates revenues for the companies, that writer deserves to be paid.
Thinking about modern times in Hollywood, you think maybe the studios saw what is happening today coming. with newer AI-generated technologies in Hollywood. Now, of course, we can always learn a lot more about the future when we look back at the past, and things seem to be repeating themselves, don't you think? The studios were remaking their own back catalogues because the industry was in crisis and writers were on strike, so new material wasn't really coming into the studios. It was then the studios who said, aha, we don't need these silly writers. We already own 80 years plus of classic stories. Remakes, reimaginings, and questions of intellectual property rights have been a staple of Hollywood since the very beginning of motion pictures. There have been many big-budget remakes of classic Hollywood movies throughout the whole history of cinema, such as Ben-Hur in 1959, which was a remake of the 1929 silent film, or indeed the hugely popular Oscar-winning Last of the Mohicans, released in 1992, that was a movie that had been made at least 4 or 5 times before Michael Mann's version became the standard, and the other films were almost forgotten to time. Now, I've never been a snob about remakes. I will watch them all, even if they are remakes of my favourite movies, because there are infinite ways to tell the same story, and each new generation will have their own theories and approach to life, and each generation will have their own hang-ups that they want to explore, and the horror or fantasy genre is the perfect place to work out all of those repressed feelings and ideas. I will admit that some remakes I've disliked intensely, such as the reimagining of Mark L. Lester's fantastic Firestarter, which was very poorly remade in 2022 by an obviously underexperienced director. But there was also a plus to that remake. There was a great score by John Carpenter, that movie, who, funnily enough, had been originally slated to direct the original 1984 film, but was turned out, as a result of his masterpiece The Thing, tanking at the box office and also getting universally bad reviews in the 1980s. But thank God for that, because we instead get his fantastic score for the remake of Firestarter, which I listen to very often. So even the worst remakes may have a plus, and that score would not exist without that poor remake. Every cloud has a silver lining if you give it a chance. Well, most of them do anyway.
Please, no, please.
Liar, liar. Pants on fire.
Romero's The Crazies was made in 1973 on less than a shoestring budget and undoubtedly reflected the social turmoil of the Vietnam War and the Watergate era. Set in the small Pennsylvania town of Evans City that is contaminated by a military plane crash that releases a bioweapon called Trixie into the town's reservoirs. The film serves as a parable for government incompetence and the fragility of civic order.
Look, you put martial law on a town, drop a sneak perimeter around them like that army becomes an invasionary force. Those people are going to resist.
We're all concerned with Evans City, Mr. Hawks, but our primary consideration at this point is national security.
Its deliberately chaotic editing, handheld camera work, and documentary realism underscore the breakdown of authority perfectly, and for me, The Crazies was where Romero really began to find himself as a film director, and its scope is huge and ambitious for its minuscule budget that he had to work with. Critics and scholars often view it as an extension of Romero's thematic universe, one that includes Night of the Living Dead, in which the true horror lies not in the infected people, but in the institutional failure, human weaknesses, and how all order, when personal survival is in question, might break down. It's like, who would you become if there was a threat to your existence? Would you help others? Or would you fend solely for the survival of yourself and those you hold dear? Breck Eisner's 2010 remake version relocates the story to Iowa, expanding the narrative scope and emphasizing visual clarity, visceral scares, and exciting thrills. With a budget of approximately $20 million, the remake features modern practical and CGI effects, but never goes over the top. The effects are used wonderfully to enhance the paranoia and look of the movie, and even in the explosive ending, the visuals, when I was watching for the first time on the big screen, all blew me away, and most importantly, I think, serviced the story. The ending is big and visual effects driven, yes, but for me it worked perfectly. Eisner knew when to be atmospheric and creepy with his horror, but also knew when to make it big. And the climax of the Crazies is a masterclass in the build-up of tension and drama that leads to an awesome, explosive climax, one that the viewer will definitely leave the cinema feeling excited by. The Crazies 2010 also has the kinetic and wonderfully graded cinematography of Maxime Alexandre, who had previously worked on the well-received Hills Have Eyes remake of the Wes Craven classic just a few years earlier. And that is no surprise, as the early 2010s saw mostly horror remakes hitting the big screens, and they were the bread and butter of many Hollywood crews. We had the Amityville horror remade, Friday the 13th, Hills Have Eyes, The Omen, My Bloody Valentine, House of Wax, and Chainsaw Massacre, all remade in just a few years of each other. The list is massive of the horror IP that was remade in this decade, but especially in the last few years of the 2000s due to the writer's strike. Alexandre was one of the many great choices made by director Breck Eisner as he took on the remake, and his camera work and lighting brings a flowing, landscape-driven, apocalyptic feel to the movie that in my eyes is one of the best-looking horror movies of that decade. Alexandre would also go on to shoot the gorgeous killer's POV in the slasher classic Maniac remake in 2012. So needless to say, the Crazies visually was in great hands with Maxime Alexandre. I also have to mention the score for the movie, as it's composed by master musician Mark Isham, who is a composer whose work I have followed ever since I heard his first beautiful synth-based score, composed for the horror movie masterpiece The Hitcher in 1986, one of my all-time favourite movies. Isham has a resonant, jazz-inspired sound that just seems to permeate every scene of the Crazies, with a beautiful, echoing space through the music, especially in pieces such as The Long Walk, as the characters head out into the bleak horizon to meet their fate bravely and head on. It is a stunning score. Another piece worth mentioning is Let It Mean Something, a driving, beautiful, almost hypnotic piece that plays as one of the characters sacrifices themselves for the good of the others. It gives me chills whenever I hear it. Isham is one of a kind, and he was a perfect match for the apocalyptic and yet hopeful sound of the movie as our characters fight to survive. It is a score that is constantly on my playlist, as is most of Isham's music. Give it a listen if you're an ambient music or soundtrack fan, and I promise you will not be disappointed. And of course, bringing Isham on board is another right move by the filmmakers. They didn't just employ any new young composer or cinematographers, they went for the best, and most importantly, who was right for the job. I think that is a mistake many horror remakes make. They just choose any old director to take on a classic that also has a cult following, and they don't respect that history or following. I will never forget the remake of Candyman in 2021, which was a movie I was anticipating because I'm a big fan of that horror franchise.
Candyman. Well, we're still alive.
My heart sank a little when I was watching promotional material featuring the new director, who said they were a fan of the original, so that was a plus. And then they proceeded to say that the iconic opening of Candyman was just a simple drone shot that anyone could achieve these days. And at that moment, I knew the Candyman remake would fail. Because though unintentional, I think, there was a bit of a lack of respect for the original there, and they simply didn't get the skill and importance to the story of that iconic opening shot of the city like a beehive or an urban jungle. It was the perfect opening for an urban myth.
They will say that I have shed innocent blood. What's blood for, if not for shedding?
And to me, that was a bit of a lack of respect, or more should I say, a lack of understanding. And as I say, not out of disrespect, but perhaps out of a lack of experience on this new director's part, as they just quite didn't get the technical side of how beautiful the original Candyman is.
They will say I shed innocent blood. You are far from innocent, but they'll say you were. That's all that matters.
And from that, I knew the remake wouldn't be able to just pull itself up stylistically or technically in order for a new take on Candyman to succeed. I just thought I should mention that, as it's something I see quite often with remakes. A little respect goes a very long way, and I think a lot of remakes just don't give the originals the respect they deserve, whereas the Crazies definitely had respect at its core from the very beginning, but creatively had its own road to travel. The story of the remake focuses on Sheriff David Dutton, played by Timothy Oliphant, who gives Dutton a strength and will to survive that is fueled by his love of his wife and also a determination to win no matter what the cost. You can imagine Dutton being a great cop before this all kicks off, one that is a cornerstone of holding his community together. Dutton's wife, Judy, is the local doctor, played with a rich range of emotions by Rhoda Mitchell, who I was in awe of at this time in her career due to great roles in High Art, Pitch Black, Melinda and Melinda, and Silent Hill, all great movies and performances. Mitchell also makes her character fierce and a fighter. Together, David and Judy are one of my favourite pairings in a horror movie. They fight to survive, but they fight for each other. And that is the beauty of their relationship. They are both incredibly strong-willed, and I love that about these two characters. But they also try to help everyone around them that they possibly can, like I believe a sheriff and a doctor really would do in a real-life tragedy. They are very well-written characters that I feel are two of the most relatable performances I have seen in modern horror. And when things fall apart, they kick ass and are perfectly written heroes for an action horror flick.
God damn it!
Come on. Hurry up. Go.
And while they are similar to the original, in that David and Judy are a firefighter and a nurse, in Romero's vision, Eisner made these characters very different and modernized their relationship into one of codependence, but equally relatable to the original characters.
Faster!
By choosing to do this, and also do his own thing with the story, but also paying a service to the original characters, he created an updated version of the characters, but kept their romantic relationship that was the guiding force and emotional grip of the original movie that worked in the original. And to Eisner's credit, he created his own vision using Romero's poetry, and you've got to give him credit for that.
You want to sit here and die? Tell me. And I will sit here and die with you.
One thing Eisner and writers Scott Kosar and Ray Wright took out of the movie was almost all of Romero's governmental satire. In the remake, we never see generals or presidents arguing over how many lives they can afford to lose or how many towns they can destroy in order to contain the virus. Eisner created a more contained and claustrophobic horror movie with a strong survival narrative. We never leave the protagonists to follow other storylines or characters, as in Romero's movie, where we follow a general's narrative from the military point of view and a governmental angle, and then that of the survivors also. The remake very smartly sticks with main players, and the film is stronger because of that choice. Romero's film is dialogue heavy and spends time with each character as they slowly go insane. It's not really told from one particular point of view, it's disjointed, and we often leave the main cast for substantial amounts of time to see the government trying to deal with the crisis and infection.
Calling Mr. Brubaker.
This is Brubaker.
Yes, sir, we've completed your voice print check, and we have the president on the line.
But the remake goes straight for the jugular and spends its time on scary set pieces and creates a horrifying atmosphere where even in the middle of what seems like a desolate stretch of road, terror can come from anywhere. The atmosphere in Eisner's movie is great and scary, while the disjointed feel of the original works perfectly with Romero's kinetic madness he creates in his edits, whereas Eisner's skill lies in the composition and the striking visual style of the movie because he is a true filmic artist, one particularly visually minded. He strands us with the main characters so we feel connected to them and the situation they are in, and then, when they are in peril, we feel scared for them and relate to them as regular folk. Again, a very smart move on Eisner's part. He understood that the audience should connect with these people and be trapped in the town with them. A great storytelling choice to keep us engaged for the full hour-and-a-half long running time, which is another plus to Eisner's vision It doesn't hang around too long. It's a short, sharp shock to the senses. He doesn't get self-indulgent with too many new ideas. He takes the premise of the outbreak, which is perfect already, and is the perfect story for a hard-hitting action horror film, and literally runs with it. And once the crazy starts, it never stops, and it's a genuine thrill ride and a very entertaining horror movie. Now, on the infected in the remake, they are much the same as the original. They are hyper-violent victims of a believable biological contagion. And while much of the government distrust has been stripped from the story, I think it could be said that Eisner's vision reflects post-9/11 and post-Iraq war anxieties about bioterrorism and contamination that were a real worry for the public and were featured heavily in the media around that time in the early 2000s, such as the stories we all heard about anthrax quarantines in the news.
It's because now in living in New York City, right, where I think before September 11th, what happened was inconceivable. Now in my mind, anything is conceivable.
I don't think it's a question of whether it's going to happen. It's simply a question of when it's going to happen and where.
It's no surprise, then, that Americans are stocking up on emergency equipment in case there is a bioterrorist attack.
Yes, we sell gas masks.
While the remake preserves the essential premise of an outbreak destroying a small-town community that seems to be a microcosm for the whole country, its tone shifts from subversive critique to kinetic spectacle, and the Crazies 2010 nails this transition. What many remakes lack is the guts to go out on their own, and most seem to have a disdain or even a lack of respect for the original. That is not the case at all with the Crazies. The remake has a strong sense of what it wants to say and what kind of movie it is, while also paying service to the original. It is an action horror movie that wants to kick ass and take its audience on a journey, a thrill ride with characters that we genuinely care about, and I think it succeeds in all of those areas. Eisner didn't try to reinvent the wheel. He saw a movie that could work better for modern audiences with a bigger budget, and he set out about creating a movie respectful to the original, but one that had a bigger budget that he felt could do the larger areas of the story in terms of the contagion justice.
What was on that goddamn plane?
Trixie. Rabdo Verde prototype.
Development for the remake began in the mid-2000s, part of a larger wave of reboots of 1970s and 1980s horror properties already owned by the studios. Eisner was already a self-professed Romero admirer, and he argued that the concept deserved a more modern reimagining that would be unhindered by the original's budgetary limitations. Filming took place primarily in Georgia and Iowa in 2009, using a mix of practical and digital effects to portray infection and chaos with a tangible realism. Eisner's take on the look of the infected was cool, I thought, and different from the original, and he apparently insisted that the infected, and I quote, not look too dead, but look too alive, drawing visual inspiration from real diseases such as rabies and tetanus, end quote. This too is a credit to the movie. The vein-throbbing infected look deranged with their wide-eyed and over-exaggerated movement and their seeming enjoyment in torturing their victims and tormenting them as they approach them with their terrifying physicality and demented look. The movie genuinely crafts some terrifying moments, such as the pitchfork that adorns the poster when an infected town resident slowly stabs a room full of people to death who are tied to their beds in a field hospital and can do nothing but wait for their demise. A truly spine-tingling moment that would not have appeared in Romero's realism, but is perfect for Eisner's visual flair. The director is a good one, and he knew his strengths, and he knew that he wanted to build an atmosphere and deliver on visual tension. The film's design emphasized a decaying Americana, underscoring the vulnerability of the heartland to systemic collapse. The result is a film that merges small-town intimacy with large-scale crisis, an aesthetic choice from Eisner that reflects both post-9/11 national paranoia and Hollywood's trend for polished, mainstream horror remakes. In short, the film has a definite visual sense of itself, and that is one of the main reasons it succeeds on its own merit. Eisner had a vision that is something that seems to be getting less and less common these days in mainstream horror, in a time when all movies seem to share the same look, even the same soundscape and design, and mostly the same kind of personal internal take on horror. They all seem to share these same ideas recently. And Eisner's take for a remake is almost wholly original, but has enough respect to pay to tribute Romero's legacy. And that is the difference between the Crazies and the rest of the tribe. Eisner left his ego at the door and did what was best for the movie, and best for the audience, and best for the story. A true director who puts the movie first, and I will always respect him for that. I'd also like to briefly touch on why the film was remade and the reason for it. The decision to remake The Crazies cannot be separated from the industrial climate of late 2000s Hollywood. Between 2003 and 2010, American studios released a surge of horror remakes. As I mentioned earlier, we had the Chainsaw Massacre, Hills Have Eyes, even Halloween. Each remake kind of repackaged the classic properties for a new generation that had been raised on more high-definition filmmaking, and I would say more horror spectacle than slow-burn horror scares. This trend coincided with the 2007-2008 Writers Guild of America strike, which halted new script development across the industry for almost 100 days. And that is groundbreaking and industry halting for Hollywood. It had never been done quite like that before and on such a wide scale, and I think it might have shook the pillars of Hollywood a little bit, and especially made the studios stop and think about what was next. And in the aftermath, studios increasingly relied on existing intellectual property to maintain production schedules and minimize their creative risk. In other words, it was mostly about the money for the studios at the time. Remakes provided a convenient solution to the money and the time that the studios thought they might lose. In their eyes, they already owned recognizable brands that required limited development time and already had a built-in audience, as they had a fan base from the original productions. So it made sense for them, really, to start remaking their own properties at this time, or at least it made sense in terms of a monetary solution for the studios. And Eisner's The Crazies emerged from a confluence of creative admiration, but also economic problem solving. And I'm sure it didn't hurt that in 2004, Romero's classic Dawn of the Dead had been remade by Zack Snyder, which I think was Snyder's first film, and that was a big mainstream hit with horror audiences. So Romero property may have seemed bankable to the studios at this time. And it was also this remake of Dawn that relaunched Romero's career in his new home of Canada, that allowed him to make 3 more Dead films towards the end of his life and towards the end of his career. It's funny how things work out in the movie business when it takes a remake of a master's work to get the master more work and more films made.
And Satan is sending his dead to us. Why? Because when there is no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth.
The Crazies remake production was greenlit during a period when original horror concepts were scarce, yet audience appetite for genre content remained strong. While the film's political subtext differs from Romero's Vietnam-era-esque critique, it nonetheless reflects contemporary fears of governmental control, biological warfare, fear, and contamination. Fears that resonate within an age of pandemics and political mistrust. In this sense, the remake functions both as an industrial product and a cultural mirror. Another reason why this movie works on so many levels, with both fans of the original and new horror fans of cinema, because it works for an older generation who love the original, but is well enough made and in the vein of modern horror movies to apply to a new cinema-going audience. It was so well thought out, and I really think The Crazies deserves credit as being a well-thought-out film that knew exactly what audience it was aiming for and was made perfectly to hit its, let's say, prospective audience. So what did the critics have to say about the movie upon its release in February 2010? The Crazies received generally positive reviews and performed respectably at the box office, earning roughly $55 million worldwide on a $20 million budget. Critics praised its craftsmanship and intensity, often calling it one of the stronger examples of the horror remake cycle. Chicago Tribune critic Michael Phillips, who I've always respected, described it as cleverly sustained and efficiently relentless, while Fangoria, a mainstay of my film reviews as a young horror fan, hailed it as a horror remake done right. And personally, I couldn't help but agree. However, there were others who condemned the loss of Romero's radical edge, arguing the new version diluted the political and satirical power of Romero's original, stating the remake missed the point of the 1973 classic. Audience reactions were solid, but not ecstatic. I know that me and all my friends thought it was a fantastic film, and Cinema Score reported it as a B- grade, indicating that the film succeeded more as genre entertainment than a cultural event. It's fair to say the reviews were surely more for the positive, but I thought it was worth mentioning that some fans and critics saw the remake as a toned-down popcorn version of the counterculture original, which to me is fair enough, but I think Eisner's movie is a great example of what can be achieved with respect for the source material and a strong technical gift by a filmmaker for telling entertaining and great-looking movies. So in retrospect, The Crazies demonstrates how remakes can serve both a homage and an industrial strategy, balancing creative reinterpretation with commercial success. The film's lasting reputation is that of a compliment to the original, and that is what remake directors often get wrong. They think they can do better instead of complimenting the original, and of course, that is almost always impossible, but Eisner wanted to compliment the original film. His movie is atmospheric and a well-crafted horror thriller, and although it never achieved cult status on the scale of Romero's original, its presence in horror is always felt in discussions that I have with other film fans, and there is many appreciations such as this one that I'm making now that are littered all over the internet and YouTube. I think the Crazies remake has almost become canon, and is always mentioned along with Romero's original, and that exemplifies how remakes can refresh older concepts for new audiences without entirely abandoning their roots, and respectably want to join them and become part of the earlier film's legacy in the best way possible, by paying enough service to the original to show that you care, but also paying respect to the fans as well, as the filmmakers of The Crazies did, and I think this remake delivers in spades. It's more than just a simple retelling of Romero's 1973 story. It encapsulates the evolution of American horror and the shifting conditions of Hollywood production. The remake illustrates how industrial constraints, including the writer's strike and the economic logic of safe properties and IP, shaped creative decision-making in the late 2000s. And as well as being canon with Romero's work, I think The Crazies stands as one of the best examples of doing what is right for the movie itself, not for some young director's chance to prove their worth. If they want to do that, they can go out and write and direct their own damned independent movie, just like Romero did. Getting towards a conclusion, I think what this remake did right was take itself seriously. They picked a great composer, not just some new kid on the block, but Mark Isham, who knows exactly how to score a movie. They picked Maxime Alexandre to shoot, who had a proven track record with The Hills Have Eyes. And of course they picked a director who had respect for the original and who had his own visual flair and style, enough so that we would get a great looking movie with its own style, striking visuals that were all technically executed brilliantly. Most remakes fail because they decide to go the opposite route. They say, let's give this director a chance because of one great short they made, or they are hot in the zeitgeist right now. Let's get them because they are cheap and might create something great. The Crazies made the right choices from the very beginning with respect. And respect goes a long way in this world with fans like us who take our horror, and especially who take our George A Romero very, very seriously. Thanks for listening to my take on the Crazies, when sometimes remakes get it right. If you did like this content, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all my YouTube channel members and Patreon supporters. And if you haven't already, please consider joining the Boneyard for members' perks, movie reviews, and more. You can always check out the store tab if you want to help support independent content creation here on the channel. And don't forget to leave a comment below so we can keep this conversation going about remakes, because it's your contributions that keep me digging up classics right here in the Boneyard. So please take care, everyone, and remember, don't drink the water.